Scheherazade by Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and it was inspired by the Arabian Nights in general and by some particular scenes from Sinbad in particular. So I thought it would be appropriate. It's one of the pieces of classical music that I grew up listening to and certainly influenced my appreciation for and being drawn to stories like the Arabian Nights and the Seven Voyages of Sinbad. And I'm obviously drawing a connection between those two sets of stories, and I'll explain what the connection between them is. So we're starting a little bit late today, which means I'll have to keep my pacing going. But as you'll see, some pretty awful things happen to Sinbad the sailor, Sinbad the merchant, and if he couldn't survive the things he survived, I can survive some technical problems that get us started 5 minutes late. So it's not a problem at all. So, as many of you know, my name is Michael Ovarhola. I'm variously a writer, editor, and publisher. And I would like to welcome you to our Beyond the Podium presentation on the Seven Voyages of Sinbad. And Manuel, our cruise director, has done something special. He found a Sinbad movie. I'm not sure exactly which one it is, but I believe it's showing at 2 p.m. today in the theater, and that's why we scheduled our Sinbad presentation today, so they would sort of complement each other. So I'm going to go see it, and I don't know if it's one of the good ones or not, but it'll be fun. It doesn't matter if it's good. It'll be fun, and there will be themes from it that will resonate, whichever version it is, with some of the things that we're looking at today. So what we're looking at here, before we move on, is a 1932 color lithograph by Russian artist Ivan Bilbin that depicts one of the voyages of Sinbad. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, as I've done throughout my presentations, I've tried to include as wide a variety of art from many different periods as possible to really reinforce the idea that these stories were influential and inspired other media. So it is, first was a oral storytelling media, and then it was written, and then it, of course, has inspired music and various artworks. So that's something I try to emphasize as we move ahead. And apropos of technical difficulties, this is not the right PowerPoint presentation, so bear with me while I call the right one up. So I guess we all just need to have a good sense of humor about these things. So please do bear with me. Here, I'm just going to unplug this so you don't have to look at everything on my computer. So fortunately, I am old and jaded enough I don't get flustered like I might have at other periods in my life. So here we are. Here's the right PowerPoint. Aha. There we go. So, the stories of Sinbad, the Seven Voyages of Sinbad, are especially appealing to me for a number of reasons. One being that we are now and will be sailing through the very waters where Sinbad's adventures took place, namely those of the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf. And one thing that bears mentioning as we move ahead with this presentation is that the tales of Sinbad are not merely fantasy stories. They're derived from the experiences of merchants and sailors throughout the region of the Indian Ocean during the period of the Middle Ages in the Arab world. So more or less the 8th to the 12th centuries AD. So what we're looking at here are actual trade routes. They might not have been this well developed, say, in the 7th or the 8th century, but by the 12th or 13th century, you had sailors that were routinely sailing from places like Port Suez, which is the city that we passed by when we came through the Suez Canal, or Basra up there by Iraq. They were routinely sailing around the Arabian Peninsula or to India or Ceylon, and some, the most ambitious, were going on to the Spice Islands of Malaysia and Indonesia and even China. So there was really very highly developed international trade during this period, and the people who were conducting it were deliberately going to strange lands to conduct trade, were washing up on foreign shores when their ships wrecked, were seeing strange animals and other creatures, and these are the basis for the stories that we're looking at today. These aren't things that people made up. These are sailors' tales and merchants' tales that were extrapolated upon and turned into what were presented to the audience as feasible stories. So we can see here that much of the upper left-hand side of these trade routes trace our route on this very voyage. We're off the coast of Oman right now. So some of you may already be aware that the 7 Voyages of Sinbad are part of a much broader collection of works known as the 1001 Nights, a collection of stories and folk tales compiled in Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, so the Middle Ages. Often referred to as the Arabian Nights, this work was collected over many centuries by various authors, translators, and scholars across West Central and South Asia and North Africa, and comprises individual stories, like 1,001 of them, that trace their roots back to ancient and medieval Arab, Persian, Mesopotamian, Indian, Jewish, and Egyptian folklore and literature. So they have a very, very diverse basis. Many of the tales in the Arabian Nights were originally folk stories from the early Islamic era, so 7th, 8th century, while others, especially the frame story, which involve a king named Shahryar and his wife Scheherazade, the namesake of the piece of music we are listening to, who we can see depicted in the image at left, were most likely derived from Persian works that in turn drew upon stories from India. The tales of the Arabian Nights vary widely in theme and tone and include history, animal fables, tragedies, comedies, romances, poems, burlesques, and even erotica. Many of the stories include fantastic elements like jinns, ghouls, intelligent apes, sorcerers, magicians, and legendary places, and intersperse them with real people and places, blurring the line between fantasy and reality. The subset of stories about Sinbad are, however, robust enough to warrant a presentation entirely of their own and could probably not be given proper treatment as part of a more general presentation on the Arabian Nights. The tales about Sinbad were also not part of the earliest 14th century version of the 1001 Nights, written version, and rather appeared as an independent story cycle in the 17th and 18th centuries. During this era, they began to be associated with the larger collection of the Arabian Nights, starting with a 1637 Turkish version of it, and Sinbad's stories then first appeared in English in British linguist and explorer Richard Francis Burton's 1885 translation of the 1001 Nights. And one of the influences that I find that's interesting, one of the influences on the Arabian Nights, which will be recognizable to many of you in this image on the left, are Aesop's fables. So Aesop's fables were from the era of the Roman Empire, but Arab scholars were either reading Latin or had translations of these things, and many of Aesop's fables are recognizable amongst the stories of the 1001 Nights. Suffice it to say, not all translations that followed have been equal in tone, quality, or content to Richard Francis Burton's, and any number of later ones have been abridged and modified versions of earlier ones. A sense for the impact of this can be gained by comparing passages from the Burton translation with later editions, as illustrated by Sinbad's final encounter with a horrible monster known as the Old Man of the Sea, which we can see depicted here on the right in an image by early 20th century artist Arthur Rackham. And we'll talk about the Old Man of the Sea. So in a common, abridged, and cleaned up edition that's about 1/5 as long as Burton's, there is a passage that reads, "A little later, the Old Man of the Sea was flat on the ground, helplessly drunk. I kicked him then as hard as I could and ran off." So this is a sanitized version. Parallel text in the Burton translation reads like this: So I threw the devil off my shoulders, hardly crediting my deliverance from him and fearing lest he should shake off his drunkenness and do me a mischief. He's a very florid writer. Then I took up a great stone from among the trees, and coming up to him, smote him therewith on the head with all my might and crushed his skull as he lay dead drunk. So much more lurid. So while the Burton translation is often fairly violent, raunchy, and explicit, many later versions have been shortened and sanitized to the extent that in many cases they're reduced to little more than children's stories. And I venture to say many people think of Sinbad as a children's story. They can and should be that because children need good, compelling stories, but there really is a lot more to them. So Sinbad, often referred to as Sinbad the Sailor, even though he's actually much more of an adventuring merchant. He rarely ever sails anything. He hires ships, he buys ships, he commissions crews. He's certainly one of the most well-known of literary figures and the hero of a 7-story cycle of Middle Eastern origin. He is, in fact, described as living in Baghdad during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the ruler of the Abbasid Empire, who ruled in the late 8th and 9th centuries. So we actually have a historical pinning for when these stories took place. And we can see a depiction of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid here on the left. We do not know the name of any original author who might have written about this hero, though. So we know when they were set, but we don't know who first wrote about Sinbad. Sinbad's name, however, might mean something to the effect of India wind, as Sind is used to refer to some or all of India, and bad is the Persian word for wind. If so, this is most likely a literary device that points to many of the hero's adventures taking place throughout the Indian Ocean and contiguous bodies of water, in the course of which he encounters various peoples, monsters, mystical places, and supernatural phenomena. So he is given a name which really speaks to him being a composite figure. Who's the real Sinbad? There is no real single Sinbad. He's an archetype that's a composite of all the merchants and sailors who adventured during this era. And what we're looking at here on the right, by the way, is a 16th century depiction of the Persian Gulf port of Hormuz in what is now Iran, which are the namesake of the straits we're going to be sailing through shortly. I believe either later today or tomorrow we'll be going through the Straits of Hormuz. There are a number of demonstrable influences from earlier literary works upon the tales of Sinbad, and these will be immediately obvious to people familiar with some of them. A significant one is, perhaps not surprisingly, the Odyssey, which had been translated into Arabic as much as 1,000 years before the Sinbad stories were written down, and was well known to literate people throughout the region of the Arabian Peninsula. Moving ahead, we'll look at a few specific examples of influences from the Odyssey on the Sinbad cycle. Another clear influence is the Book of the Marvels of the World, which was published around 1300 and describes the journeys of Silk Road explorer Marco Polo, and which includes material that was obviously adapted for the Sinbad stories to include some of the same mythological monsters. The Roc, which is a giant bird that Sinbad encounters that we'll look at, this appears in the works of Marco Polo. And there are probably at least 4 other ancient or medieval works of legend, history, natural history, or travel that appear to have influenced the tales of Sinbad. So like the 1001 Nights, the Sinbad cycle is set within a unifying frame story that sets up and encompasses its episodes. It opens with an impoverished porter, who we can see at the far right, pausing to rest on a bench outside the gate of a rich merchant's home in Baghdad, where he complains to Allah about the injustice of a world that permits the rich to live in ease while he must toil and yet remain poor. The owner of the house hears and sends for the porter, and the two discover that both of them are named Sinbad. Wealthy Sinbad informs poor Sinbad that he became rich by fortune and fate in the course of 7 wondrous voyages, and then begins to relate them. And we will briefly look at each of them and some of the art and illustrations that they inspired. Sinbad begins by explaining how, after squandering the wealth left to him by his father, he set out on his first voyage, a trading expedition in an attempt to restore his fortune. So he's very much like the prodigal son in that respect, except that he goes out and lifts himself up by his own bootstraps, as it were, and endeavors to reestablish his fortune. Early into the journey, Sinbad and his companions go ashore on what appears to be a small wooded island in order to search for food and water and to rest. When a cooking fire set by the sailors appears to start an earthquake, however, the men are horrified to discover that they've landed on a giant sea monster that has been dormant long enough for a forest to grow up on its back. This immense creature, by the way, is sometimes described as a whale, but is obviously significantly more epic in scale than any normal animal. It is, in fact, much more likely to have been inspired by the Cetus, a monster from Greek mythology that was defeated by the hero Perseus. And what makes that especially appealing to me is that the Greeks associated the Cetus with Ethiopia and the Red Sea, waters that Sinbad sailed through and could have been sailing through when he encountered the island fish. Two creatures from the Bible, the great fish that swallowed the prophet Jonah, or the primordial Leviathan, might have also served as models for this sea monster. And they also have an affiliation with this region, with the Gulf of Aqaba or the Red Sea. So rushing back to their ship, the sailors managed to cast off and set sail, narrowly evading destruction as the island fish, irritated by the fire, plunges into the depths. In their necessary haste to escape, however, Sinbad's companions leave him behind, and he is saved only by clutching at some flotsam that, by the grace of Allah, he sees drifting by, a wash tub actually. Sinbad is eventually washed up on the shores of a heavily wooded island, and while exploring it, encounters a groom of the local king and helps him save a mare from being drowned by a supernatural aquatic horse. In gratitude, the groom brings Sinbad to the king, who befriends him and allows him to become a trusted courtier. So people like Sinbad. Bad things happen to him, and then better things happen to make up for them. Then, one day, the very ship on which Sinbad originally set sail docks at the island, and he proceeds to reclaim his goods, which are still in the hold of the vessel. So there's sort of a moral here that there is essentially an honesty about the merchant trading class. They're not just going to steal this guy's goods because he apparently has perished. Sinbad then gives his benefactor, the king, his goods, and in return, the monarch gives him rich presents, which our hero subsequently sells for a great sum of money. Sinbad thereafter returns to Baghdad, where he resumes a life of ease and pleasure. At the conclusion of the tale of his first voyage, Sinbad the sailor gives Sinbad the porter a substantial gift and bids him come back the next day to hear more about his adventures. And on the left, we can see an 1896 illustration of Sinbad by artist William Strang. And at right, we can see a depiction of an island fish by a friend of mine, an artist named Amanda Call, which I commissioned from her for a book that I published a few years back. So this actually appears in one of the books that I've published. All right, so Voyage 1 was our longest treatment. We're going to be a little more succinct with the others. Sinbad the porter returns the next day, and when he resumes storytelling, Sinbad the sailor tells how he grew restless in his life of leisure and, filled with a desire to travel the world and see marvelous cities and islands, set out to sea again. So much like any of us who find ourselves on cruise ships again and again, it's the same sort of thing. Well, I'm tired and I'm glad to be home. Well, let's start booking the next cruise. So kind of the same thing with Sinbad in a way, because a lot of what motivated him was not just making money or trading, it was seeing new and wonderful things. Accidentally abandoned by his shipmates again in what is a recurring trope in these stories, Sinbad finds himself stranded on an island. There, he discovers giant eggs laid by the legendary rock, a bird so large it is capable of hunting elephants. And we could see this depicted here in what I think is a particularly evocative 1924 illustration by English illustrator Edward Julius Detmold. Sinbad contrives to escape the island by tying himself to the leg of a rock and thereby being transported to a valley filled with giant snakes so large that they can also feed upon elephants and pose a threat even to the huge birds. And you're going to recognize, as we're looking at these voyages, things that you've seen in other movies, things that you've read in other stories, either because they originally were in the Odyssey, which influenced those stories, and this one, or they were picked up from this one directly. So Sinbad, on this new land, we don't know if it's an island or mainland, discovers the floor of the valleys and is carpeted with diamonds, which we can see depicted in this illustration on the right, and that there are people who harvest them by throwing huge chunks of meat into the valley. When the birds carry the meat back to their nests, these people drive them off and then collect the diamonds stuck to the carrion. Wily Sinbad fills a large sack with diamonds and then straps one of the carcasses to his back and is thereby carried back to one of the giant birds' nests. And there, he's rescued by the diamond hunters, returns to Baghdad with a fortune in precious gems, and witnesses many fantastic things along the way. Restless for travel and adventure, Sinbad sets sail again from Basra, a port city in what is now Iraq, and which is depicted here on the left. Before long, however, he and his companions wreck on an island where they are captured by a giant that had large canine teeth like boar's tusks and a vast big gape like the mouth of a whale, and nails on its hands that were like the claws of a lion. This monster begins eating the sailors, starting with the captain, because he's the fattest. We could see this episode illustrated here on the right in an 1898 image by an English artist named Henry Justice Ford. Sinbad hatches a plan, and some of you are probably sensing a familiar theme here. Sinbad hatches a plan to blind the monstrous giant with the two red-hot iron spits with which it has been impaling and roasting his companions. He and the remaining men then proceed to escape on a raft they constructed the day before, but the giant's mate kills most of the escaping men with rocks as it hurls at them as they make their escape. So we mentioned previously that the Odyssey was among the works that directly influenced the tales of Sinbad, and those familiar with this earlier epic will recognize here what is clearly a recasting of the encounter between the hero Odysseus and the Cyclops Polyphemus. Sometimes the giant in the Sinbad cycle is shown with two eyes. Sometimes it's shown with one. This artist showed it with one because he recognized the conflation of these two stories. So Sinbad survives, of course, and after further adventures, including an encounter with a giant python, which he employs very clever stratagems to survive, returns home to Baghdad even richer than he was before. Driven by his perpetual restlessness, Sinbad eventually sets sail again, and as one might expect, becomes shipwrecked. He and his companions find themselves among naked savages that try to feed them a plant that robs them of their reason. Who came to our Odyssey talk the other day, by the way? Okay, so a bunch of you. So you'll recognize this theme too. So they feed them a plant to rob them of their reason with an eye to making them docile so that they can fatten them up for purposes of eating them. Sinbad, however, realizes what is happening. This is why they're called the Tales of Sinbad and not the Tales of some other guy, because the other guy gets eaten. Refuses to eat the mind-numbing herb and manages to escape from the cannibals. This is yet another episode that has clear connections to the Odyssey. In this case, the encounter of Odysseus and his men with the Lotus Eaters, who are sort of like ancient drug addicts, and that appears to have been conflated with the story of the man-eating Laestrygonians. So Odysseus encountered these Lotus Eaters, he encountered these cannibalistic giants, and they've been conflated into one encounter here. Sinbad is thereafter rescued by a group of spice gatherers. So this is a reference to commodities that are being traded, who take him to their own island and present him to their king, who characteristically befriends the adventurer and bestows upon him a rich and beautiful wife. And there are all sorts of tells that would indicate that this is somewhere in India. When his wife becomes sick and dies soon after, however, very sad, Sinbad is horrified to learn that in this land it is customary to entomb a living spouse with the remains of a deceased one, robed in their richest clothes and most valuable jewels. Sinbad is thus lowered with the corpse of his wife into a subterranean communal tomb with a jug of water and 7 pieces of bread, which we can see depicted here. Before he can succumb to starvation, however, a living woman and her dead husband are also lowered into the cavernous vault, and Sinbad proceeds to slay the wife and take her rations. Our hero repeats this process a number of times, and soon he has a large store of provisions along with the treasure the interred people had with them, but is still trapped. One day, however, he follows an animal through a passage leading to a cliff high above the sea. There he hails a passing ship, as we can see here, and is carried back to Baghdad, where he resumes his life of leisure, collecting up all sorts of grave goods on his way out. And we're seeing a certain character development here. Sinbad is becoming brutalized by a lot of what he's experienced. He doesn't kill anything in his first 2 voyages. He blinds something in his 3rd voyage, and by his 4th voyage, to survive, he systematically kills people who are put into this tomb, and he justifies it by saying, well, they've already given up on life. They know they're dead. What's the difference between them coming down here and starving after a few days, or me braining them with a thigh bone? It's the same. But this does represent a certain evolution of his thought and what he's willing to do to survive. The 5th voyage is one of my favorite. The 1st and the 5th, I think, are a lot of fun. Eventually, however, Sinbad once again yearns to travel so that he can experience the wonders of foreign lands. He's looking for a new itinerary. And the ordeals of his previous journeys having faded somewhat in his memory, he ventures out once again. While passing a desert island, Sinbad's crew spots a gigantic egg that he recognizes as belonging to a rock. Going ashore, the crewmen examine the egg and are moved to break it open and eat the giant chick that it contains, prompting Sinbad to order them back to the ship and to depart before the parents can return. A pair of enraged rocks soon overtake the ship, however, and proceed to destroy it by dropping onto it boulders they have clutched in their great claws. And I think this is an appealing story arc for me because when the authors or tellers of the story reintroduce the same monster, it doesn't feel repetitive. The first time Sinbad encounters a rock, it never notices him. He uses it as a device to escape. And here, he and his people go head-to-head with a rock, and we see them, 2 rocks, and we see them employing various tactics to attack and kill the people that have eaten their chick. So even when they reuse themes in the story, they're being used in different and creative ways. So his ship is destroyed. So once again, he is shipwrecked, ends up on an island where he encounters the aforementioned vile old man of the sea, a demonic being, it's not a normal person, who manages to get onto Sinbad's shoulders and twist his legs chokingly around his neck for purposes of enslaving and abusing him. Becoming worn down by carrying this horrible creature around on his neck, who uses him to collect fruit and carry him around. Being worn down and knowing he'll eventually die, Sinbad contrives to ferment wine from fruit he finds on the island. So he finds some wild grapes, he finds some gourds, he starts crushing up the grapes and putting them in the gourds when the old man is sleeping on his shoulders, and then leaving them in the sun to ferment. And he's drinking this wine to help reduce his pain and get him through this ordeal that he's dealing with. The old man of the sea sees him drinking this at one point, snatches the gourd from him, and gulps it down. Having no familiarity with or resistance to alcohol, the loathsome creature passes out, and Sinbad manages to dislodge and then kill him, as we read in our episode at the beginning. A ship subsequently rescues Sinbad, and that's more than a contrivance. That's a literary statement. Another ship always comes along. That's speaking to the volume of traffic throughout the Indian Ocean and past these lands. So it isn't just that he's lucky, it's that there's a lot of ships out there doing things. So sometimes he has to wait a couple days, sometimes he has to wait a couple of weeks. Eventually, a ship's going to come by if he's in a shipping lane. So a ship rescues him and takes him to the city of the apes, whose inhabitants spend each night in boats offshore while their community is stalked by man-eating primates. Sinbad eventually finds a way to profit from the situation, as usual, and thereafter finds a ship to take him home once again to Baghdad. Sinbad ultimately sets out on yet a sixth voyage that is violently shipwrecked when his vessel is smashed apart on the rocky cliffs of an uninhabited island. And my guess is, we passed through some straits called the Bab el-Mandeb the other day, the straits between the Red Sea and the Sea of Arabia. Bab el-Mandeb is the Gate of Tears, and it is called the Gate of Tears because so many ships wrecked there. And in all of the shipwrecks that Sinbad has, I think we can expect that one of them must have been in the Bab el-Mandeb. That would make sense because so many had been wrecked there. So he's shipwrecked on the shores of an uninhabited island. There's no food to be found, and Sinbad's companions starve to death one by one until only he remains. Sinbad manages to build a raft from wreckage and also discovers that the island's streams are filled with precious stones and ambergris, which he secures a load of before departing. And on the left, we can see a 1914 drawing by Milo Winter showing his escape with yet more wealth. You notice he's not just escaping, he's escaping with a raft full of expensive things. Our hero falls asleep during his journey and eventually awakens upon reaching the city of the king of Serendib, identified with the modern nation of Sri Lanka, which we can see in a 16th century map. Sinbad presents himself before the king of Serendib. So we know specifically where he was this time because we're given the name of the place he's at. And he tells the king of his own great monarch, Harun al-Rashid, prompting the king to ask Sinbad to carry presents back to him, among them a cup carved from a single ruby, a magical bed made from the skin of a giant serpent, and a beautiful slave girl. And so Sinbad returns to Baghdad, presents to his caliph the gifts from the king of Serendib, and recounts the wonders of that land. Restless and optimistically forgetful, Sinbad sets sail once more, and as usual, before long, he's wrecked upon an uninhabited coast. And here he swears an oath. Why are there 7 voyages and not 8? Some authors have followed up with an 8th. But here, he swears to Allah that if he makes it home, he'll never set sail on another voyage again. So he swears to end his travels if God will bring him home safely. So he builds another raft. He is actually really good at building rafts now, we would think, and travels along a nearby river to a great city where he marries the daughter of a rich merchant and shortly thereafter inherits her father's fortune when he dies. So, like I said, things go really badly for Sinbad until they go really better. Sinbad learns in the course of all this that once a month the people of the city are transformed into birds. And he has one of these bird men carry him high into the sky, so high that he can hear angels singing the praises of God. Pious Sinbad praises God himself, but when he does, fire blazes down from heaven and badly injures the birdmen, who become angry and abandon him on a mountaintop. There he meets 2 youths who are the servants of God, either prophets or angels, and who give him a golden staff, which he uses in some episodes we won't recount here. Sinbad then returns to the city and upon reaching it, learns from his wife that the birdmen are devil worshippers. And this is a magical power they have to be able to transform into this avian form and fly once a month. But she and her family are not, because they had moved to the city several years before. Sinbad's wife convinces him to liquidate their possessions and then return to Baghdad, taking her with him and resolving to finally retire to a life of peace and leisure. And some versions of the Sinbad story cycle simply end there, while others briefly return to the frame story in which Sinbad the sailor bestows a final generous gift upon Sinbad the porter. And Richard Francis Burton also provides an alternate 7th voyage in which Sinbad returns to Sri Lanka and becomes an ivory hunter and discovers the graveyard of the elephants and enriches himself therewith. In the modern era, The tales of Sinbad have inspired or been adapted into innumerable movies, television series, comic books, animated cartoons, novels, pieces of music, and even video games. And what we're looking at here, in fact, is a scene from the 1973 film The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, which I venture to say, based on the ages of the people here, including myself, many of us probably saw in the theater in 1973. I did. My parents took me to it. So there have been a number of sequels or eighth voyages, as noted, including one story by Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe wrote an eighth voyage of Sinbad. A little whimsical. Some of these derivative works strive to be true to at least the spirit of the original stories, while others bear little or no resemblance to them beyond the name of their main character. There was I think, Disney Sinbad animated film, for example, but it's set all in the Mediterranean. So they take the Sinbad stories and they take the character Sinbad, and then they completely blow off putting it in the Arabian Sea or the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean, and they just throw it into the Mediterranean. So why are they doing that? Because they're lazy hacks and because it's easier to sell ancient Greece than it is ancient Arabia to some audiences. So my final comment on the tales of Sinbad in this presentation is to suggest that they are best enjoyed when not viewed simply as works of fiction, and for even the most fantastic elements of them to be taken as embellishments to reality and not simply fabrications. They're a product of an era when adventuring merchants, at continuous risk from things like shipwrecks, could indeed make great fortunes, where fearsome peoples did dwell on alien shores, where sailors landed to trade or seek provisions, and where a creature like an eagle on the horizon might indeed appear large enough to carry off an elephant. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me. As with my other presentations, I'm always walking that fine line between getting enough words in to do the subject justice and not just abusing you by having so many words. So thank you so much for bearing with me. I hope you enjoy that. There will be a movie at 2. And as many of you have learned, I'm approachable and I love these subjects and I love to talk about them. So thank you very much. And if you can make it to the movie, please do. And I don't know if I'm giving another talk yet. We'll find out. If I am, it's going to be...